So it's a privilege to be with you today. I'm humbled that you all have taken time out of very busy and important schedules to join us for the day here, to join Mark and me. I really appreciate that, and I don't say that lightly. I truly am humbled that you have taken all of this effort to be with us today, and I trust that God will use it in your lives, as Mark said, to encourage and to strengthen you in the ministry of God's Word. This day is devoted to persuasive preaching. My favorite story about persuasion actually comes from the science of ethology. Ethology is the science of studying the behaviors of animals, animal behavior, science of ethology. And there's a story about a study done with mother turkeys that I think can teach us something about persuasion. Apparently, mother turkeys are very, very motherly, if that's the right way to say it. They're very, very protective of their chicks. So if a chick says cheep, cheep, then the mother turkey responds and takes care of the chick. The problem is that if a chick does not say cheep, cheep, the mother turkey ignores the chick, may even kill the chick. So the study of animal behavior, these people realize that mother turkeys respond to the cheep, cheep sound of chicks. Now, mother turkeys also respond to their natural enemies, the polecat, or what we might call a ferret, and they will attack a ferret. They will go into a clawing, angry rage against any ferret that comes into the enclosure, and so they will attack the ferret. So researchers decided that what they would do is they would stuff a polecat and they would drag it through the pen and see what a mother turkey did. So they put the polecat in the pen, they began to drag it through, and the mother turkey just went into a rage and attacked this stuffed polecat, tearing it apart. Then what they did was they put a tape recorder inside the stuffed polecat. And they had the tape recorder, they had recorded the cheep, cheep sound of baby chicks. So they took the polecat, the stuffed polecat, put it in the pen, and they played the cheep, cheep sound. What do you think the mother turkey did? It actually responded positively to this polecat, and in some cases actually gathered the polecat under its wings because it was making a cheep, cheep sound like a mother chick, like a baby chick. And if they turned off the recording, the polecat would attack the chick. The mother turkey responded to the cheep, cheep sound, click, the recording turned on, and the predicted behavior took place in the mother turkey. Robert Cialdini is a social psychologist who studied persuasion in our culture and how it works in many settings of American life. And he's written several books, but his best-selling book is called Influence: How and Why People Agree to Things. And he argues that humans are actually not much different than those turkeys. We have social triggers, mental triggers that get triggered by the things in our society, our culture. And these social triggers can be tapped to persuade us to agree to do or think a certain way. And salespeople utilize these triggers very effectively. Today we call it the psychology of marketing. The ancient Greeks called it sophistry. When Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 2 verse 4, "My message and my preaching were not in persuasive words of wisdom," he was not, as Mark has already set the stage for us, wonderfully set the foundation for us today. He's not saying that all persuasion is wrong. Because Paul will later say in 2 Corinthians 5 verse 11, "Knowing the fear of the Lord, we persuade men. Same word. Paul was talking about a particular kind of persuasion called sophistry. In the first century world, or by the time of the first century, two segments of philosophy had developed, or rhetorical philosophy had developed in the Greco-Roman world. There was classical rhetoric, and there was sophistic rhetoric. And sophistic rhetoric had taken over the first century world. These were the popular speakers in Greek culture, as Mark was saying. And they were certainly popular in Corinth. Sophistry is the ability to attract large crowds of people by the intentional use of persuasive techniques. Sophistry is the ability to attract large crowds of people by the intentional use of persuasive methods. So the sophists attracted the crowds with their verbal pyrotechnics. They made the news. They made the headlines. They got the big crowds. They knew how to use the trigger features in their culture. Click, they turned on the recording, and crowds followed them. And Paul is saying that we must never, ever build our spiritual persuasion on human trigger features. We must avoid the idolatry of methodology lest we fall into the seduction of sophistry. And that is never more important than today. As Mark said, this is not showtime when we enter the pulpit. It is not about the idolatry of methodology, which is taking over, honestly, much of the church today, brothers. And we're falling into the trap of sophistry. So preaching is persuasive speaking. But persuasive preaching is power on a leash. And it's God's leash. And the leash is 1 Corinthians 2, 4, and 5. God set the leash for us. And He says, these are the boundaries. These are the limitations that we must avoid. It's not about triggering the click words in people's minds so that they do what we want them to do, or they are attracted to what we are doing here in our churches. Persuasive preaching must be effective, but it must be ethical, God-honoring, and God-dependent preaching. So, to start thinking about persuasion, we need to kind of look back at the Greco-Roman rhetoric of the day, because whether we like it or not, rhetoric has shaped the preaching from Paul's day to our day. So let me rehearse some of that information for you as we get started today. Definition of rhetoric. And we have most of this information, a lot of this information in your notes, so you can turn there and use the notebook. Aristotle defined rhetoric as the faculty of discovering the possible means of persuasion in reference to any subject whatsoever. Larry Overstreet gives us a useful definition of rhetoric which can be adapted for preaching. Rhetoric is persuasive communication in the service of truth which should create an informed appetite for good. I believe the goal of preaching is to bring about change in our listeners, transformation. Preaching is intentionally persuasive, but all persuasion is not healthy persuasion. Persuasion is winning people over to a new attitude that is predictive of enduring change in their behaviors. However, we must not win people over by merely touching the triggers in their minds and in their hearts that produce a click-word response. That works. You can attract crowds with the right techniques, no question about it. But that's not persuasive of preaching God's way. That's not actually changing hearts and minds. because that's only done by the Spirit of God. It's not done by you guys or me. True spiritual persuasion produces lasting changes that love what is true and good from the Word of God. So there were three species of rhetoric: judicial, deliberative, and epideictic. Judicial or forensic rhetoric was legal speech. It was courtroom rhetoric, oriented around the defense or prosecution of an individual before a jury of his peers. So the speaker focused on arguments and refutation of the arguments, those kinds of things. And Mark has already alluded to the fact that in 1 Corinthians 2, one of the words that is used, demonstration, comes from judicial rhetoric. It was evidence. Then there was deliberative rhetoric. That was the rhetoric of the assembly. And this was the rhetoric that was most commonly used in the church, of course, because it came from the rhetoric of the Greco-Roman assemblies, where they would gather and there would be speeches in the assembly. And so that transferred rather readily into the assembly of the church, because ecclesia is the assembly. And then there was epideictic rhetoric. Epideictic rhetoric was oratory of display, oratory of praise and blame. It was the rhetoric of splashiness, if you will. It was the rhetoric that displayed the orator's skill. In an epideictic speech, the speaker appeals to the emotions of his audience through the beauty of his speech, through the skill he had as a speaker. And the speaker is seeking to praise sometimes common values which he wanted the audience to share with him, or that they did share with him. Often used in funerals, of course, and other kinds of settings, celebrations. That was epideictic speech. It was rhetoric of display. Now, the New Testament contains all three of these kinds of rhetoric. The New Testament letters in particular contain all three of these forms of rhetoric. Most of the epistles are deliberative rhetoric, but there was judicial and epideictic rhetoric as well. Only about somewhere between 5 to 20% of the population of the Mediterranean world could even read or write. This was not a literate society. This was a world devoted to oral communication. That's why Jesus said, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." He did not say, "He who has eyes to see, let him read." It was an oral world. The epistles were written to be spoken out loud. Furthermore, they were written in all capital letters. It was called uncials, with no separation of words or sentences, no punctuation. So, if we were to take Romans 1 and put it in the English text, at least in the form of the writing of the New Testament, it would look something like this. Now, you can read that, but you've got to work at it a little bit. Reading was done out loud. So somebody who took Romans to read to the congregation had to practice this thing. He had to read and sound out the text. In fact, Augustine famously said of Ambrose that he was the most amazing man he had ever met because he could read without moving his lips. Why? Because reading in those days was done by sounding out the words. That's the only way you can really read a text like that. The speaker would then have to be well prepared to speak to the church, to speak Paul's letter to the church. He would have to be able to put the right emphasis in the right place so that it made sense to them, so that it had an impact. So, think of the letters in the New Testament as sermons, as rhetoric. Timothy or Titus or any of the other people who were dispatched with the letter would prepare. They would go over this text so that they could deliver Paul's words with punch. They preached Romans or Colossians or whatever the text was. Now, in Greco-Roman rhetoric, there were three proofs, sometimes called the rhetorical triangle. The category in Greco-Roman rhetoric was the category of inventio, or invention. It referred to the speaker's invention or choice of resources to use in convincing his audience regarding the issue before them. So invention or inventio referred to the means of persuasion. And the means or methods were called proofs. The word rhetors used for proof is our New Testament word for pistis, faith. That's the word that meant proof. Pistis was proof. Faith is proof. So we need to understand that faith is both a product and a process. John Calvin defined faith as a knowledge of the divine benevolence toward us and a sure persuasion of its truth. What is faith? It's a sure persuasion. It is proof. Now, proofs in Greco-Roman rhetoric could be of three kinds: ethos, logos, and pathos. In rhetoric proper, proof came from a demonstration. So the goal of the speaker was to prove his case by a demonstration of the evidence, particularly judicial rhetoric, selected to elicit belief. So Paul used the same word that was used in rhetoric, epidexis, which is the word for demonstration in 1 Corinthians, was a word that came from the legal setting, as Mark alluded to, came from judicial rhetoric. It was the evidence or the demonstration. So when Paul says the proof, faith, comes from a demonstration, he's talking about rhetoric. He's using rhetorical terms. Demonstration shows us what we should believe. It proves the case for us. So these terms, proof, pistis, faith, and demonstration, epidexis, became important for our understanding of what Paul is saying here in 1 Corinthians 2, 4, and 5. Cicero and later Augustine modified Aristotle's three modes of proof. So I've put it up here. Logos is the word which preachers speak. Ethos is the character with which preachers speak. And pathos is the world to which preachers speak. Pathos, ethos, logos. Three proofs for the evidence that we need to produce faith, which Paul will say ultimately comes from where? God. Now, the three proofs are not equal. In Paul's theology, these are not equal proofs. Logos takes precedence. That's up here. The centrality and authority and sufficiency of the Word of God is top dog. That's vital to biblical preaching. So God uses His Word, logos, communicated through the character, ethos, of His preacher, using the passions and skills of the preacher, pathos. The preacher has to know the audience, of course. That's pathos, is audience related. But it's his passions and skills that connect with that audience. But that's the third level, if you will, of proof in Paul's theology. The apostolic model for preaching stressed message over method, spirit over emotions, and avoided pathetic preaching. What's pathetic preaching? Pathetic preaching is preaching that only focuses on the world to which we are speaking. Because the world does not have the answers. The Word does, logos, coming through ethos. Now, yes, we have to understand our world, but if all we do is preach in a way that is attractive to our world, that's pathetic preaching, folks. And it's not the power of God that will change lives. And that's why we spend so much time and effort to get it right, to exegete the text of the Word of God. So the preacher's equation looks something like this. The Holy Spirit times the message plus the preacher plus the hearer equals persuasion. Or the Holy Spirit times logos, ethos, and pathos equals persuasion. Now, we're going to examine these factors today as we dive deeper into persuasive preaching. But with all of that as background from the ancient world of rhetoric, let's move to the modern world of persuasion and see what we can learn from there about persuasive preaching. Social psychologists John Cacioppo and Richard Petty developed a model they called the elaboration likelihood model. It was based on its extensive research in the field of social persuasion, and it became, now it's commonly used as the basis for many classes in journalism and marketing and the psychology of marketing and all of that today. This is a secular program here. But it connects well to our preaching. It helps us understand how to do it persuasively. And in ELM, there were two modes or routes, if you will, to persuasion. There was the central route and there were the peripheral routes. The central route, which I've marked in blue here, seeks to stimulate the audience to think seriously about the core issue of the message, the logos, if we're going to turn it into the Word of God here, turn it into preaching. The peripheral routes, the yellow, uses social and cultural cues or triggers to help people make a decision. Now, the reality of our world today is that people have to process so much information that they often look for shortcuts to that information. And so they often make decisions, even big decisions, based upon the shortcuts, the peripheral cues. But we don't want that to happen with our preaching. We don't want the decisions to be made based upon the peripheral cues, because then it's not going to last. It's not going to be truly transformative. The degree to which the audience is likely to elaborate mentally on the issue and process the relevant information is the degree to which the central route works. When the audience is not motivated or does not have the ability to process the information, then you need to use peripheral cues to get them back to the message. Now, we don't use the peripheral cues to focus on the decision. That's a no as preachers. What we want to do is use peripheral cues to get them back over here to focus on the message, to elaborate on the message. And elaboration means to process, to mentally, emotionally, willfully process the core issues that we are preaching and proclaiming. I've adapted this model for preaching because I think it's very helpful for thinking through the process of persuasive preaching in our sermons. So we're going to be developing this throughout the day. Let's start with the central route to persuasion. The message starts it off. As expositors of the Bible, we have a message to deliver to our people. The message is logos. It is God's message. It's not ours. Guys, we create a sermon. We don't invent a message. The message is given. The Bible is the message, the logos, that God calls us to speak. Logos is the first proof in persuasive preaching. Going back to 1 Corinthians 2. My logos and my kerygma, my message and my preaching, were not with persuasive words of wisdom. They weren't with the techniques of the day. The message is critical. So we have to always see God as the teacher. When you stand up, men, to preach, who is doing the teaching? God is supposed to be doing the teaching through us. We're the conduits of the teaching. We're not the inventors of the teaching. It's not even about us. God is the one who is doing the teaching, so the more our message explains the Word of God, the more we can point to the Word of God, then the more it'll be God doing the teaching. The more we talk about ourselves, the less it is about God's teaching. He is the teacher. You can go back to the Old Testament, to the book of Deuteronomy, and the emphasis there constantly is that God is the teacher. So gather and hear the Word of God. That's what it's all about. Logos is the central root to all Christian influence. So, then there's the intention. Oops, got ahead of myself. Intention to persuade. So you have the logos. That's the first step. Then we have ethos, because preaching is persuasive speech, but it depends upon the character of the speaker. Starts with who we are as preachers. We cannot persuade anyone. We cannot win anyone over if they don't trust us. If we have no credibility with our audience, we will have no power to persuade. Because God chooses. Isn't that amazing? That just boggles my mind that God would choose me. But God chooses to use us to be the conduits. But the credibility of the message, He chooses to come through us. That's incredible to me. All right, let's move on in the diagram. Then there's the motivated to process. Are they motivated to process? This is pathos. Motivated, and do they have the ability? Now we're into pathos, the world to which we speak as preachers. So processing is elaboration. The listener will elaborate mentally on the message. Elaboration means that the person carefully examines the core arguments of the message, and to the degree that the person is ready to elaborate on the central message, there will be lasting persuasion. The mental change will be predictive of new beliefs and behaviors. Acts chapter 17. Let's go there. Acts chapter 17, verses 1 through 4. Let me read that for you. Acts 17, 1 through 4. Now when they had traveled through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And according to Paul's custom, he went to them and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and giving evidence that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, this Jesus, whom I am proclaiming to you, is the Christ. And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas along with a great number of the God-fearing Greeks and a number of the leading women. We'll just stop right there. Notice this is a persuasive context, right? These people, some of them, were persuaded. Now, what means of persuasion did Paul use in these verses? What are the means of persuasion that we see in these verses? Anybody want to throw one out? Reason from the Scriptures, right? So there's reason, that's one way. Logic, that kind of thing. But it's from what? It's from the Scriptures, the Logos, so the reasoning. Reasoning from the Scriptures. What's another one? There's 4 of them here. What? Explaining and giving evidence. So that's two. Explaining and giving evidence. Explanation, to open, the word means to open up something, interpret information, to have an understanding. So first there's reasoning from the Scriptures. There's our source of knowledge. Then there's explanation, to open it up, to interpret it. And then there's evidence. Literally, the word means to set before someone, to prove with data, to demonstrate evidence. So Paul did that too. He reasoned, he explained, he gave evidence, and what's the fourth one? Proclamation. Proclamation. To announce the facts or truth with passion and winsomeness. Those were the four means that Paul used in persuasive preaching. Reason, explanation, evidence, and proclamation. We don't just say, oh, if you like this or not, or maybe you should consider this. We say at the end what? This is truth. This is God's truth. We proclaim it in the end. And that's missing a lot in churches today. We're afraid to proclaim anymore. Now, elaboration as the central root of persuasion is based upon the well-established principle that repetitive exposure, which is the modern terminology, ancient Greeks called it amplification, is foundational to long-term persuasion. People need to hear the message repeatedly. It's not just a one-off. They need to overlearn the message. And in the psychology of modern persuasion, they say the same thing. You've got to overlearn the message. You've got to help people overlearn that message if you're going to have any lasting influence. Now, we don't care, for our purposes, whether they buy that car or not, but a salesman will want you to overlearn what he's trying to tell you. But we do care about the Word of God, and we want people to overlearn it. So we have to, and you've all heard this expression, I know, keep the main thing the main thing. They need to hear it again and again and again. That's how elaboration takes place. Now, preachers need to use multiple ways, if you will, to help listeners elaborate on the truth. Paul centered his message on the Scriptures, but he used reason, explanation, evidence, and proclamation to persuade his listeners. So we do as well. When you preach, guys, you're using a variety of, you're using all of those means too, if you're preaching effectively. But your goal is to keep the main thing the main thing. And that's the Logos. All right. Ethos. Let's go on to that. Aristotle considered ethos, moral character, the most effective means of proof. Now, stop and think about that one for a minute. Aristotle, secular Greek philosopher, thought that ethos was the most effective means of proof, of pistis. Comes through character. It's interesting that the early, or classical Greek, not sophistic Greek orators, but classical Greek orators really stressed character. The Athenian model of deliberative rhetoric in the assembly was a model built on ethos, as Aristotle said. In fact, in the Athenian system, any speaker was disqualified from even speaking who was suspected of certain dishonorable acts. He could actually be prosecuted not for the original offense, but for continuing to speak in the assembly after he had committed the original offense. So, if you'd done something wrong and you stood up to speak in the assembly, you could be prosecuted for speaking. Because they said ethos or character was so foundational. My goodness, if we adopted that in our government, how many people would we have speaking anymore, right? Seems that way. Character, ethos. Quintilian, a first century orator, expanded Aristotle's rhetorical proofs by combining moral character with verbal skills when he promoted that oratory was good men speaking well. Good men, character, speaking well. Character and skill go hand in hand in the pulpit. Let's look at another text. 2 Corinthians 5. 2 Corinthians 5, verses 11 to 13. Second Corinthians 5, verse 11, therefore, knowing the fear of the Lord, we persuade men, but we are made manifest to God. And I hope that we are made manifest also in your consciences. We are not again commending ourselves to you, but are giving you an occasion to be proud of us, so that you will have an answer for those who take pride in appearance and not in heart. For if we are beside ourselves, it is for God. If we are sound-minded, it is for you. So, therefore, knowing the fear of the Lord, we persuade, there's our word again, we persuade, but we are made manifest to God, and I hope that we are made manifest also in your consciences. What are the two motivations for Paul's persuasion here? That is, beyond the fear of the Lord. Obviously, that's the original motive for him, but it's tied up in one of the two motivations. What are the two motivations? What's that? Known by God, manifest to God, so that's vertical. What's the other one? Known by men, horizontal. So, character in Paul's preaching was built on those two motivations, those two motives. I want to be revealed to God when I preach. I want to be revealed to others as I preach. That's a word we might use, transparency. When you preach, you are transparent to God vertically and to humans horizontally. Transparency. I don't know about you guys. That scares me. Not the second one, the first one. That's a scary dynamic that should pervade every one of our sermons. That every time I preach, I am naked before an almighty God. Of course, I am anyway, but especially when I preach. And whenever I preach, I am naked before the audience. They can see through me. So, ethos, God's character in preaching, is that when I stand there and I realize that God is seeing everything, the inner motives, all of that, and through me as His conduit, people are also seeing all of that. Here's another important word today: authenticity. Transparency and authenticity. That's necessary, both of those are necessary for preaching that comes from the character that God is building into our lives. And of course, that all comes from the fear of God. That's where it starts. Honestly, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if men entering the pulpit today in our culture really fear the Lord when they stand there. There are so many times when I have stood up to preach on a Sunday morning when I just go, God, I haven't got it today. I'm doing the best I can, but I am terrified that you will not be pleased with what I have to say. I'm not terrified that they won't. I'm terrified that you won't. Do we really, really fear the Lord? Mark said it earlier, right? That is foundational to preaching. That is as core as it gets. That we are authentic before God, transparent and authentic, and therefore we can be authentic and transparent to other people. Exposed before God and exposed before others. Virtually anyone who studies rhetoric, particularly from a Christian perspective, identifies source credibility, ethos, if you will, as a matter of primary importance in persuasion. Kouzes and Posner, who've written a major study on leadership, Mark's very familiar with this text from his work with corporations in leadership. Kouzes and Posner, very, very significant study book on called the Leadership Challenge. That's right, that's the Leadership Challenge, right? They say this. These are secular researchers. They say this. The first law of leadership, if we don't believe the messenger, we won't believe the message. That's what they say, secular researchers say, is the first law of leadership. If we don't believe the message, if we don't believe the messenger, we won't believe the message. Ethos. That's character. So we have to ask ourselves, what determines the credibility of the preacher? What determines our credibility before people today? And there are several factors. Kouzes and Posner, in their research, this is secular research now, came up with a number of factors that are critical for developing ethos or character, the messenger. That's us as we speak. The first is integrity or trustworthiness. The highest rated character trait from their surveys across the corporate world was honesty. Now, isn't that interesting? The economic world of our day, money, but the highest rated quality of leadership in that world is still honesty. Honesty is not just saying the right words, it is living the truth. It is integrity. It is trustworthiness. And trustworthiness is a major factor in determining source credibility. That's what we're talking about with ethos. We're talking about source credibility. Our credibility. Guys, we as pastors are in the character business. There's no way around it. People expect us to live what we preach, to be authentic. When you talk with young people today, that word comes out again and again. They want people who are authentic. However, trustworthiness is more than merely telling people the truth. Listeners are evaluating our intentions. One critical factor listeners use in evaluating our integrity is our perceived motives. If the preacher is perceived as manipulative, what happens to trust? greatly reduced very quickly because trustworthy people do not use and abuse other people for their ends. Selfish motives will kill trustworthiness. That's going to happen very rapidly in any church that you are pastoring. If people begin to get the perception that you are about your own self-interest here, it's going to kill your ethos as you preach. There's an interesting expression that Paul uses in his letters. He uses it a number of times, and we won't look at all the times, but you've seen it, I know. It is the phrase, God is my witness. You've seen that phrase, right? God is my witness. Now, if you read commentaries, you will find that a common interpretation of that phrase, God is my witness, is that Paul is saying, he is invoking God. He is actually expressing an oath. That is, God will strike me dead if what I say is not true. So it's an oath, if you will, that he is taking before God. I want to suggest to you that's a little bit of a misunderstanding of what Paul is doing here. And here's why. God is my witness was a common phrase in the Greco-Roman rhetoric world. Now, they weren't thinking about God as we know God. They were talking about their gods. But the expression, the gods are my witness, is a common phrase in the rhetorical world. And as a matter of fact, it was so common in the rhetorical world that it came over into the Jewish world. And so within Rabbinic Judaism, they often spoke about, and in their case, it's not the gods are my witness, but it is God is my witness. So this phrase was a rhetorical phrase that Paul is using here. And it's not really an oath then. He's basically saying that God testifies to my character. God is my witness that I have a character that you can trust. He's my witness. I'm calling on God to be my testimony, my witness. It was used in the Athenian assemblies. God is a character witness. Now, when we look at ethos then, integrity and trustworthiness, we need to be able to say with Paul that God's my witness. He testifies to my character. If you could ask God today about my character as I preach to you, God would testify as my witness that my character is true. Well, that means that any time I preach, my character better be true if I'm going to say God's my testimony. Because basically I'm saying to people, you could ask God right now, and God would tell you that I'm right before Him. Wow. That's a powerful statement now by Paul. And it's a statement we need to be making whenever we preach His Word. So the first way that we demonstrate ethos or credibility is integrity, trustworthiness. The second way is competence or expertise. The Kouzes and Posner, in their studies of the corporate world and leadership, said that the second greatest proof or evidence of credibility was competency or expertise. The leader needed to be understood as being competent. Now, how do I prove competency? Well, skill in oral communication is highly important for determining competency in our society. Whether we like it or not, people consider somebody who has good verbal skills, that's one of their factors in determining who's competent. So if we speak well, that's a help in determining our competency before our listeners. And listeners consistently rate the speech that we deliver, now they don't do this consciously, but subconsciously, studies have demonstrated, based upon things like inspiring, powerful language, moderately fast rate of speech. If we're slow speaking, that's not generally considered competent. The use of common, mainstream vocabulary is a big thing in competency. They want to hear words that they understand, not esoteric words. Familiar speaking style, enthusiasm, passion. These are all things that go into how people view competent speakers. Now, for pastors, I mean, that's all good, and we can take homiletics classes and we can talk about how to deliver a message. And honestly, there are days when we do it well, and I know there are days when I've delivered messages rather poorly. Thankfully, God still uses it in people's lives. But we can talk about all of that, but for pastors, what are people looking for in terms of our competency or our expertise? Well, clearly we have to know the Bible. People expect that we know the Bible, theology, that we understand what the Bible has to say. But unfortunately today, there's a lot of other factors. You know it. You know that pastors have to be, or people want pastors to be, experts in an awful lot of areas. Programming, administration, our culture, family needs, counseling. You know what? It's next to impossible to be experts on everything. We can't be. But we do need to be competent in how we handle the Bible, because that's our core competency. And do our best in many of the other areas. Also be self-aware so that we can refer people when they have needs. But we had better be competent in the core competency, which is the Bible. And that we need to be clear about. You know, people have all sorts of felt needs that they express to us. But felt needs are the symptoms of real needs that the Bible addresses. The Bible does not address all felt needs that people have. The Bible will not solve everybody's problems in life, every felt need they have. But the Bible does address the real needs that people have, and we had better be competent in identifying and diagnosing and helping them see how the Bible addresses those real needs. Because that's when preaching becomes truly persuasive, transformative. And then there's the liking or similarity principle. Robert Cialdini extensively documents the liking principle as a powerful tool of persuasion. People are more likely to be persuaded by those they like than by those they don't like. It's pretty simple. Liking is closely related to similarity because studies have shown that we tend to like those who are like us. And that's one reason why friends are more persuasive than salespeople, as the success of a lot of businesses built on friendship sales in the home attests. Friendship evangelism illustrates the power of the liking principle, because people are going to trust the friends who give the message. We tend to believe a source based upon how well we like that source. And pastors can use the liking principle all the time. We do. Think of persuasion or influence like a bank account. You're making deposits in your influence bank account every week, every contact with people. You're making deposits in their lives and in the bank account. At some point, you're going to withdraw on that bank account with people. Because there will be at some point where you have to use your influence with them in your preaching and in your personal work. And what are you doing? You're withdrawing from that bank account. Well, if you overdraw that bank account, you've lost credibility. They're not going to follow you anymore. So you have to be constantly investing in healthy relationships to be persuasive. That's ethos. Let's see. Pathos is the next one. And I think I'm going to give you a break before we jump into this, but let me just introduce it. We tend to think of pathos as emotions, because that's how we use that word a lot. But it's more than emotions. Pathos in the Greco-Roman world referred to any audience-centered method of persuasion. Any audience-centered method of persuasion. So, Paul used methods of persuasion with the Corinthians. We're going to look into the letter of Corinthians and look at some of the ones he used, because he was using the audience-related methods. That's pathos. It's not just emotions or passions. It's any methods that connect you to your audience. One of the men during the break made a really good point to me. He said, you know, the devil attacks us in this very area of credibility quite often. And while we don't want to be all dramatic about spiritual warfare, there is spiritual warfare going on in our churches, and it hurts the most when people in our own churches might attack our credibility or question our credibility or lead others to think about our credibility improperly. And I think that's a really good point. We were discussing the fact that Paul, in his letters, he spent quite a bit of time, particularly in Corinthians, where he was defending his apostleship. And what was he doing? It wasn't just a selfish thing. He was defending his credibility, because credibility is important. And then I don't remember one of the men here was saying, well, that's why we need to be doing shepherding. Because in shepherding, you're building up your credibility as you deal with people. You're making deposits in their lives during the week, so it isn't just about what you do when you stand up in the pulpit. And he's absolutely right, because if through shepherding we build up our credibility with people, then we can weather those storms that come our way when our ethos is attacked by the enemy. Because that's one of the quickest ways to destroy a church, isn't it? Sadly, I've seen men have to leave the ministry because they no longer had credibility there, even though some of those things were often inaccurate accusations, but they just didn't have any credibility. Part of the problem, as the brother said, who's the brother who was talking to me? Oh, right back there. What's your name again? Randy. As Randy said to me, well, you say it about how we have to build up our credibility. We haven't been doing that.
Yeah, I think a lot of pastors now will say, I need to be in the office, I need to study, which is important, but if you're not out in contact with your sheep, you're not going to be able to speak into the lives. And accusations will come up, and we won't be able to let it.
Yeah. Really good point. I like that. Thank you, Randy. Let's move on to pathos, which is the means of persuasion. And Paul used a number of methods, and we can't deal with all of them, of course. We'll touch on these few. He used some methods in the book of Corinthians to be pathetic, if you will, to influence people. And one of the ways that he used that touched his audience was what we might call mini-max. Now, he didn't call it that, obviously. But Emery Griffin, in his book on persuasion, coined this term mini-max to describe the principle that humans act so as to maximize their benefits and minimize their costs. Humans act so as to maximize their benefits and minimize their costs. This is human nature. So we're talking about audience-related methods when we talk about pathos, and this was a common method in classical Greek. And 1 Corinthians falls into the category of deliberative rhetoric. Aristotle said that the goal of deliberative rhetoric was to emphasize the benefits or the advantageous over the harmful. Well, that's minimax for people. That was a common goal of deliberative rhetoric. And 1 Corinthians is deliberative rhetoric. It was speech to the assembly or the community. The most important goal of deliberative rhetoric was then to show the benefits of a certain course of action to the community. What was good or beneficial for the community. And Aristotle actually used a term that Paul uses frequently in 1 Corinthians. It was the word sympheros or symphero. The Greek word meant benefit, advantage, or what was good. Now, we'll just look at one of the passages, maybe. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 35. 1 Corinthians, I'm in 2 Corinthians, that doesn't help, does it? 1 Corinthians 7:35. Paul's in the midst of making quite a persuasive appeal through here, and he says, "This I say for your own benefit, not to put a restraint upon you, but to promote what is appropriate and to secure undistracted devotion to the Lord." I'm saying this for your benefit. And he does this over in chapter 10, verse 33. We'll go there. Verse 32, "Give no offense either to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit or benefit, but the profit or benefit of the many, so that they may be saved." So there is this emphasis on maximizing the benefits, if you will. And that was a tool that Paul used in his persuasive toolbox. Another one was exemplification. The use of exemplification was a way to show the audience through example what they should do or not do. That's what exemplification is. Exemplars are examples used for moral instruction. Now, you as preachers use exemplars. You give examples frequently, you should in your sermons, I think, in order to drive home the lessons, the instruction. Paul used exemplification in 1 Corinthians quite frequently, but perhaps the most obvious one was in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, where he's using the Old Testament and he's referring to a number of Old Testament stories and connecting exemplars from there to the world that he was preaching to. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 6. "Now these things happened as examples for us, so that we would not crave evil things as they also craved." And then verse 11. "Now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come." The use of exemplification is a common tool in our preaching to persuade others. Personal examples can be very effective because we're also dealing with our ethos and our character by giving examples from our own personal lives, just so long as we're not always the heroes. But an example where we struggled with something and learned and gained victory, that can be a powerful thing in influencing our people. Particularly in a pastoral setting. That's why I like the concept of pastoral preaching, not just preaching to anybody and everybody, but pastoral preaching, where they know you as the shepherd. Then they're going to know your example that you use, and it's real, and it's powerful, and it will be hugely influential in their lives when you do that in your sermons, provided It's authentic. And you're not just the hero all the time. Now, we have to be a little careful with exemplars because we don't want to fall into moralism. Moralism is the idea that you can make yourself good by what you do. We can't do that. That's totally wrong. The only way we can do anything that is true or good before God is if God does it through us, and it's done on the basis of the cross work of Christ and what He has done in our lives in changing us. So we don't fall into the trap of moralism that you can just go out and be good if you try hard enough. But we do want to use examples that people can grasp and see how they connect to their lives, and they can see in our lives that we are an example. Paul used himself as an example in the New Testament fairly frequently. So we must do the same thing. Exemplification is another one. Digression or digressio was a common rhetorical device that was used by the Greco-Roman rhetors. As a speech, 1 Corinthians particularly used it when speeches were very long. Then they would use digression in the middle of the speech. And as a speech, if you look at 1 Corinthians as a speech, that's a really long speech. And so digression was important. According to Quintilian, one of the philosophers, teacher of rhetoric, a long speech needed what was called a digression in the middle of the speech to break the flow of the speech. Now, we wouldn't call them commercials. What would we call them? We would call them illustrations. An illustration is a digression. It serves to keep attention by changing the pace and the flow of the speech. Even sometimes the wording and style of the illustration. So you would use a different style, maybe a different tone in your speaking. The topic would be related, but almost a sidebar maybe to the main thought. So 1 Corinthians 13. I don't know if you've thought about it, and of course commentators deal with 1 Corinthians 13 in a variety of ways, because it comes right in the middle of this 12 to 14 section where Paul is dealing with spiritual gifts and all of that. And right in between chapter 12 and verse 14, we have this chapter, 1 Corinthians 13. When you first read it, you go, wow, this seems out of place here. And many commentators have pointed this out, of course. He puts it right into the middle of that extended discussion. But it does fit the larger purpose of Corinthians, which is unity. And it does relate to the others, but it's to chapter 12 and chapter 14 and tongues and the controversies that they had. But it's a digression, if you will. Now, 1 Corinthians is deliberative rhetoric. 1 Corinthians 13 is epideictic rhetoric. What is epideictic rhetoric? They took a value and they spoke about it in much more emotional and flowery language. That's epideictic rhetoric. 1 Corinthians 13 took a value, love. And by the way, in Greco-Roman rhetoric, this was a favorite value. They would take love and they would speak these long treatises about love. So this fits right into the rhetorical understanding of the New Testament, because they would take that and speak about love in very flowery ways. Now, Paul doesn't do terribly flowery stuff here, but when you read 1 Corinthians 13, there's some flowery language in there. There's some style, some rhythm, some approach there, wording that's out of the ordinary for the rest of 1 Corinthians 13. What's he doing? He's doing a digression, a different style, and an appeal emotionally before returning to his main argument. You do the same thing when you preach well, and you use an illustration you're digressing a little bit. It's going to better relate, but you're still digressing. And what happens when you do that? What happens today if I stop and do an illustration? Everybody goes, huh, something interesting to listen to. It breaks it up. It breaks into the flow and helps people pay attention a little bit. And it explains what you're trying to do. So digressions become very important. Paul used them. Placement is another one here. Ancient rhetorical handbooks talked about a technique they called insinuatio. It was when a hot topic was the issue and it was difficult to deal with. So if the speaker thought the audience was not favorably disposed to the idea, he had two ways to deal with it. And we do the same thing today in speeches. Two ways to deal with it. You could be direct with that hot topic and go right to it at the start, or you could hold it until the end, and you had built up credibility with your audience. Now, I think 1 Corinthians 13 is an insinuatio. 1 Corinthians 15, is an insinuatio. Resurrection. I really think that one of the hottest topics and questions that Paul had to deal with was the question of the resurrection, because that was core. That took them right to the heart of Christianity. Why didn't he hit that one right off the bat? Because it's a hot topic, and there was a lot of debate and discussion in Corinth about it. So he waited until he built up the credibility in answering questions and dealing with issues, and then he hit the hot topic, like any good persuasive speaker would do. That way, he had built up his connection with the people, and they were ready to listen to this vital chapter. I think that's a placement issue. And in sermons, and in developing your sermons, you work with placement. Placement is very important in a sermon. Where you place that most powerful illustration or that most powerful argument has a lot to do with how influential the sermon will be. Generally, in messages, what comes first and what comes last are the most powerful points at which you will place things. So we call that our introductions and our conclusions. That's when you're going to grab people. Somebody says an introduction should grab people by the throat and throw them up against the wall. Well, I don't want to be that violent, but it should be. It's a powerful moment, but so are conclusions, beginning and ending. So Paul used pathos in his preaching, certainly. Look at Acts chapter 19 and verses 8 and 9. Acts chapter 19, verse 8. Paul entered the synagogue, continued speaking out boldly for 3 months, reasoning and persuading them about the kingdom of God. So here we are in a persuasive situation. But when some were becoming hardened and disobedient, speaking evil of the way before the people, he withdrew from them and took away the disciples, reasoning daily in the school of Tyrannus. And then he did that for 2 years. But he was persuading them about the kingdom of God, but some were hardened and disobedient. Now, persuasion, same word, same concept. Hardened, disobedient. The word disobedient is the word not persuaded. It's apatheo. It's persuasion with the negative a in front of it. So these people were unpersuaded. Well, what do you do when people are unpersuaded? You've given them the message. You've proclaimed it. You've done your best to reason and explain it. What do you do when people are unpersuaded? In a hostile audience is hard to persuade. Even in church. You know it. People are unpersuaded sometimes. Oftentimes, maybe. There's a lot of hard hearts in our churches. Of course, we have hard hearts too. But unpersuaded. Why? Maybe it is hard hearts. Maybe, though, it's apathy. Apathy's a big one. Or perhaps they're simply not listening to you. They've moved on. They're dealing with something else, or it doesn't fit their needs at that time. They're distracted. Distraction is a huge thing we deal with today. There's chronic distractibility today. Any way you look at it, and there's a host of other reasons, even in our preaching in our churches, there are people who are going to be unpersuaded. And the question is, what do you do when people are unpersuaded? Well, now you're going to use peripheral routes for persuasion. We all do it. So when elaboration likelihood is low, then the decision is usually based on peripheral cues or triggers and not an examination of the central issues. The listener will decide based upon the shortcut techniques available in the setting. Many of our people are chronically distracted as they come to church and they listen to us. And we go through this proclamation and they're unpersuaded. They don't change. They don't respond in any way. So what we do is we use some of these peripheral routes to get them back on track, because people today are inundated with so much information that they will often use peripheral cues to trigger their changes, their decisions. And so we do too. And every preacher in this room has done it. I've done it. We use peripheral routes. Let me just stop for a minute before I look at some of that, because we're going to look at some of the tools in our toolbox for doing that. But let me stop and say this. When people decide based on peripheral cues, persuasion is usually short-lived. So you want to be careful with peripheral routes, because they're not going to, in and of themselves, accomplish long-lasting transformation in people's lives. For that reason, it's actually a good thing when people resist your original message. I know that sounds odd. We want everybody to, clap, applaud, say what a great sermon that was, Pastor, as they go out. Obviously, we want people to do that. But it's actually a good thing if people resist the message. It's a necessary part of real long-term persuasion. Because what you want them to do is truly elaborate on what it is you're preaching, not just accept it. Casual agreement can be the enemy of true persuasion. When people simply quickly respond and say, "Got it," they probably don't get it. Casual agreement can be the enemy of true persuasion. If they agree too quickly with what we're saying, we often find the results of the persuasion to be merely temporary. So don't be dismayed if you get an unpersuaded response. That can actually be a good thing for you as you work with those people in the days and years ahead. Now, it's important to understand, however, that peripheral routes should not be used to push people to make a decision. We're not doing this. We've come here, they're unpersuaded. Now we go over here. But we don't use these routes to actually make the decision We use them to do what? To get back over to here and to think through the core issues. Because that's the only way you're going to get real persuasion, is if they go back to the Logos and really consider it. Now, somebody sitting in church on that particular Sunday may react negatively. They may say they're unpersuaded, and maybe it's the stuff in their life going on. Maybe there's other things. And so you work with them through some of the peripheral routes that we use when we're working with people. And you're working them back around, and a year later, you would preach that same message, and what does the person do? They go, wow, I get it, Pastor. That has made a difference in my life. That changes me. And you go, huh, I said all that a year or 2 years ago. Why didn't you get it then? That would have made my life a whole lot easier. Of course, same thing happened with Jesus, didn't it? They didn't get it either. And Paul. But that's how the process works. And so we use peripheral routes to get them back to the Logos. And we don't want them to believe or to change based upon our arguments, our techniques, our tools that we use, because that's falling into the trap of sophistry again. It's not our methods, though we will use those. But people's faith will need to rest on, what did Mark tell us? How did he set this up? The power of God and the power of the Spirit of God. Not on the methods we use to trigger responses. That's not the kind of persuasion we want. So let's spend a few minutes talking about at least some of the tools in our toolbox when it comes to peripheral routes. We can't cover all of these, of course. There are many peripheral routes, many peripheral tools in our toolbox as preachers. I'll just name a few here. We've got cognitive consistency, paired association, sequenced persuasion, peer pressure, marketing, reciprocity, scarcity, authority, fear, guilt, attribution, conformity. These are all peripheral routes to persuasion. Some of them are biblical. For example, there is a biblical sense where fear is a powerful tool of persuasion. Their authority, so on, guilt. I'm not saying these are illegitimate tools. We use these tools, but we must be careful as preachers that we use them to get back to considering the Logos and not just get somebody to make a decision. So, for example, if I just lay a guilt trip on somebody until they feel so guilty that they're going to do what I want them to do or respond the way I want them to respond, they will do it, and I will win them over temporarily. But what happens with guilt trips? This has been demonstrated over and over again. There's a nasty side effect to guilt trips, or fear is another one. And what is that? It's called avoidance. It's called avoidance. You lay enough guilt trip on a person, and guess what? They don't want to see you coming down the road. They don't want to talk to you anymore. If you do that all the time in church, guess what? They're not going to respond to the message after a while. They will avoid it. Because we don't like guilt and we don't like fear. So those are biblical concepts. And there is, of course, God the Holy Spirit who persuades and moves people to fear and to experience guilt. But excessive guilt and excessive fear will lead people to avoid the truth in the future, even if they do it in the temporary setting. That's just an example of what I'm talking about here. These are all tools that we use, and trusting that the Holy Spirit is helping us to use them. but we also need to be careful. God's power is on a leash. And we need to be careful how we use these tools. So let's talk about a couple of them. We don't have time to deal with all of them. Let's talk about cognitive consistency. Cognitive consistency. This is a huge one in marketing and persuasion today, is cognitive consistency. It's a huge one in how we operate as individuals and as persuaders. The consistency principle forms the foundation of many, many persuasion situations. Because inherently in human nature is the desire to be consistent with ourselves. We don't like what's called cognitive dissonance, mental dissonance. We don't like the tension we feel when we are trying to hold two contradictory viewpoints at the same time. That's an uncomfortable situation for anybody. Cognitive consistency forces us to make a choice, to make a commitment consistent with any previous choices or commitments. So if we're being called upon to make a choice, but it's not consistent with what we've known, believed, or acted upon in the past, it will create this uncomfortability, this difficulty we have in making that choice. The key to persuasion in any situation is commitment. So if the persuader can get the persuadee to make some level of commitment, that commitment will in turn work to persuade the person to make a higher level of commitment. All it takes is a minor commitment to lead to a greater commitment. That's how we operate even as individuals, even as pastors. The process plays out in all sorts of settings, and car sales do this all the time, car salesmen. Written business goals. So, a car salesman, you come in and they say, okay, what are you looking for? And you lay out, I want this car, and I want it this way, and this model, or this, how many miles, and even down to color. The more they can get you to lay it out, the better they feel. Why? Because when they provide what you've just asked for, you feel compelled to buy it. If you've laid out the item, how much it costs, all of that, and then they provide it, they have got you. You're going to feel cognitive dissonance if you don't follow through. This is the cognitive consistency principle. Well, we do it as well. Business goals, church testimonials, public commitments retain the most power. So going forward in front of a lot of people is going to set up a powerful issue of cognitive consistency moving forward, because you have now publicly demonstrated a commitment. It solidifies that commitment. Public testimonies reinforce decisions. Anything that causes someone to make a commitment in public, particularly, is going to invoke the cognitive consistency principle going forward. And we use it as a tool for persuasion in church life. I served on the missions committee of a church in the 1980s, early 1980s, when I was in seminary. Some of the guys remember Pleasant View Community Church, right? I served on the missions committee of that church while I was going to seminary. And we wanted to expand our missions commitment. This was back in 1982, I think, or something like that. We wanted to expand our missions commitment, so we set a goal and we used the faith promise system. Anybody here ever used faith promises? Pretty common, very effective. So we used the faith promise system, and we set a goal of $40,000 for the missions program of our church. And we stressed to the congregation that they were, when the time came, they would make pledges based upon their promises to God. This wasn't to the church, this was between them and God. They would make a commitment to how much they would give toward missions. It was made on faith, so it's faith promise. It's what you believe God will provide for you to give. And we went through that whole process. On Faith Promise Sunday, we collected the cards and the offering plates, and shocked to find out that $80,000 was committed by that church toward missions. And we met as a missions committee. I remember sitting there with the pastor, Ivan French, and some others, and going, wow, we've got another $40,000 to figure out what to spend it on. Now, did people follow through on their faith promise? Yes. By and large, most everybody followed through on their faith promise. Why? Cognitive consistency. They had already made the commitment. Now, there's always a few people that, life circumstances, whatever, I don't know what happened, that we weren't following up with people. But that's a cognitive consistency principle that we're using in persuasion when we preach. Ask people to make a commitment and a pledge card, and they do so. We're using the principle of cognitive consistency. I've done it over the years with counseling situations. A suicidal person, and I will have them write out a pledge that they would not commit suicide until they called me or their counselor or 911. Write it right out, sign it. Why does that work? And it does work. Why does it work? Cognitive consistency. They may be tempted to commit suicide. Now, I'm not saying it's guaranteed, but they may be tempted to commit suicide, but they've made a commitment. And now they've got to call 911 or the counselor or the pastor. We're using the principle of cognitive consistency every time we do that. Now, here's the other side of the consistency principle, however. It also explains why a person who has committed to a position is very hard to change their minds. Very hard to change their minds. Why? Because in order to change their minds, they have to go back on what they've already committed themselves to. And that's a very hard thing to do. So once people, if you will, buy it, sign on, believe it, then it's very hard to change their minds later because of the principle of cognitive consistency. They're very resistant to any attack on what they believe. And in some cases, all the evidence in the world won't persuade them at that point. They are locked in. We had a lady in our church, came for years to church, Dina. She was a Jewish lady, grew up on a kibbutz in Israel. And she came to our church for years and would listen to sermons. And she said, I learned more about my Bible from you than I learned from my Jewish rabbi in the synagogue. So she loved coming. And people loved her and related to her and certainly shared the gospel many, many times with her. And I talked with her many times, and she would say, I see what you're saying. I understand. But my Jewish heritage, it means that it feels like I have to give up everything that has been a part of my life, my family life, my culture, my heritage, and I just can't make that commitment because this is all that I have. So far as I know, she never trusted openly Christ as her Savior, but she came all the time to hear God's Word. And as a matter of fact, she invited a bunch of us to her home to celebrate Passover with her, and we did that. Had a wonderful evening with her, and she was very responsive to the gospel. But what's going on? Cognitive consistency. She has a hard time separating because it feels like to become a Christian means to reject all of her past heritage. You see that with Catholics. We were talking about that the other day. You see that with many people. That's the cognitive consistency things. What do you do then? And apologists and evangelists do this all the time, is they try to introduce some cognitive dissonance just to make them think. So we'd throw in something or talk to her about something or just to get her to think, oh yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, that you try to create those things. Frontal assault won't do it. So you try to get them to think. Try to create something that's dissonant with what they're doing or what they believe as a way to break in. All right, a chink in their armor, so to speak. Let's talk about paired association. Paired association is the next tool that we often use. It's a common influencing tool that combines the liking principle and the similarity principle. It occurs when a persuader links something the audience already likes with something he wants the audience to like. So when a person associates one with the other, he is more likely to be influenced to like the intended product. The whole attractional Christianity movement was built on paired association. Seeker services, all of that, they're all built on paired association. It's the liking principle, the similarity principle. Use the same formats that the unchurched people like in the entertainment world to help them like church. Paired association. Music, dress, auditorium styles, lights, sound, drama, conversational speech, all of which are familiar formats for people, attract people to the church. That's the paired association tool at work when we do it. The similarity principle teaches us that the more the persuader and listener are similar, the greater the probability of persuasion. So a listener asks himself if the persuader thinks like him, his attitude, acts like him, looks like him, then maybe this is something I want to look into. That's the attractional model. So the simplest form of persuasion is for the persuader to pattern himself after the ways of the one being persuaded. And the sophists in the ancient world did that perfectly. And there are many people today who do that perfectly. And so they get a lot of people to come because of the similarity or the paired association, because the worship service reflects the attitude, style, appearance. Stories and testimonies, by the way, are persuasive, however, for the same reason. When somebody gives a testimony and we identify with it, it's highly persuasive because of the paired association. You can see yourself in that person. You say, oh yeah, I can see myself in that situation, or that person, I identify with that person. That's paired association. You can see yourself in the story or the testimony. To pick on Rick Warren and the Saddleback Church, what did they do? They developed Saddleback Sam. Saddleback Sam was the target. Was the person in their community that was the likely Mr. South Orange County person. And that's who they were trying to target, so then they would orient everything about church around that target person. And it's powerful. It works. But it's a peripheral tool. And we'll talk this afternoon more about the ethics of that and how that relates to the leash God has us on, according to 1 Corinthians 2, 4, and 5. But understand that is a powerful tool of persuasion today. And we all use it to some extent. Yes? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it presents a lot of interesting dilemmas, which is why, if that's the reason they decided, it won't last. Because eventually cognitive dissonance will kick in and they will begin to say, wait a minute, this doesn't relate. It's self-defeating. And that's why I'll say this afternoon more than once that in terms of ethics of persuasion, we want to be careful that we don't have them make a decision on that basis. Because if the decision is on that basis, it will be short-lived. You're absolutely right. Yeah. All right, sequenced persuasion is another tool we use. Sequential influence methods are founded on the need, again, for cognitive consistency, and they use the basic human need to be consistent to achieve persuasion. So the persuader looks at the situation, determines the needs, values, interests of the person being persuaded, and designs a sequenced process to get them to the decision we want them to make. It's commonly used in sales because of its simplicity and pragmatism. So there's a sequenced process in order to get that person to buy the car. It's commonly used in a lot of life, and we use it in our churches. Sometimes it's called foot in the door approach, where you try to get people to agree to something minor. You get your foot in the door, because then you're going to try and leverage that into something bigger. Sometimes it's called lowballing, where you make a low-level commitment or cost or whatever, and then you spring on them that, oh, well, it actually costs this much. And now you've lowballed them, and now they feel like they have to, agree with you. So there's a sequence of persuasion. Sometimes it's highballing, where you give people something that you know they won't agree with, and then you drop it down to where they will agree with it, and they feel better about it. So sales, for example, it's going to cost you $100. Oh, but it's on sale for $50. So now I feel good about it. That's sequenced persuasion. So we did a building campaign many years ago now, small church, but we'd been 2 services for many years, and we decided to build a new building, decided on faith. And so we went through the process of building committee and all of that, and I preached on stewardship and giving and investing in God's work. And then we presented from our building committee a proposed budget, and they looked at all of that. And then we had everybody attend a large group meeting, and I and other leaders just stood up and answered whatever questions they had and adjusted things so that people were comfortable with all of that. And then we had each one sign up and attend small group meetings for discussion and prayer about this important decision. And I told people, look, the building is probably the most spiritual decision you're going to make in the next 20 years, because that budget, that's going to sit in your budget like the 800-pound gorilla, You're going to have to pay that mortgage. So you want to be prayerful and thinking about this. They attended these small group meetings. Then we had a business meeting to vote. And they voted yes, we're going to go forward with this building program. And then, because we were financing it through a church bond program, then they had to sign up to actually put their money where their mouth was and sign up for church bonds. So we had set up this 2-day time when everybody would make appointments with the church bond salesperson, and they would go in and have their personal appointment and sign up to purchase church bonds. And the 2 days came and we were in the middle of a hurricane. And I thought, oh, good grief, this isn't going to work very well. Everybody kept their appointments. Not only that, everybody signed up for church bonds, and we raised in 2 days, we weren't a big church, but $400,000 in 2 days. I went, wow, God, wow. I really believe that you're working through here, for sure. Now, guess what I was using, though? I was using a sequenced persuasion process, without a doubt. Hopefully, I was always getting them back to the core issue that we were trying to put before the congregation, getting them to think through all the pros and cons of that. That's what my desire was, and ethically that's what I needed to do. But I was using a sequenced persuasion tool, without a doubt. Many building campaigns are built on that. Many fundraising campaigns are built on the highballing technique, you know. Give $500. Oh, you can't give $500? How about giving $100? Oh, you can't give $100? How about giving $50? Oh, you can't do that. Oh, you can certainly give $25. By the time you get to $25, you're like, well, sure, I can do that, you know. It's sequenced persuasion. Now, again, this afternoon I want to talk about some of the ethics behind all of these things, because we have to be very careful with these peripheral tools of persuasion. But I am trying to say that we do use peripheral tools in our communication and in our persuasion. We don't always purely stick with the central route. Just need to be careful. Preachers, by the way, preachers use sequence persuasion in many invitations. How does that work? All heads bowed, eyes closed. Now, I want any of you who are making a profession of faith to raise your hand. Nobody's looking. It's just you and God and me. And so they raise their hand. Say, okay, we're going to pray for you who raised their hands. And so you pray for them. And then okay, everybody look up. We're going to sing a final hymn. And all of you who raised your hands, what I want you to do? I want you to come down forward. I want you to come down to the front so we can pray with you and we can give you some materials and help you understand the decision you've just made. What have I done? I've used a sequenced persuasion process, without a doubt. Again, we'll talk about some of the ethics of all these things this afternoon. But I want you to understand that we do these kinds of things in our persuasion process. All right, we got to wrap this up here. Let me just give a couple of illustrations. Early in my ministry, actually it was in New Jersey. I was co-pastoring a little church down here in New Jersey, Albion, New Jersey. I don't even know if it exists in a little tiny town. So I was co-pastoring a church. I went to visit somebody, shared the gospel with them. Most frustrating experience I have ever had in evangelism. I decided after that I certainly didn't have the gift of evangelism. And shared the gospel. This man, very interested, really worked lots of questions, worked through all the issues, said, yes, I really need, but in the end, I'm sorry, I can't believe. Well, why? It's too easy. There's got to be something more to this. I just can't believe. I spent hours trying to argue this guy into the kingdom, and it didn't work. I used every argument they taught me in evangelism and apologetics, and he agreed with it all. No, I just can't believe. And I'm telling you, I believe that guy's in the kingdom of heaven today. You know why? Because I think a year or two later, somebody talked with him and said, do you know Jesus? And he said, I want to. And they said, okay, here's how. Great. And he believed like that. And somebody walked away saying, wow, who said evangelism was hard? I said 5 words and this guy believed. Yeah, right. Exactly. Why? Because God's doing it, and it wasn't His timing yet. And all the arguing I could do in the world wasn't going to change that. Mac McDougall had been coming to our church for a number of years. His son was an active member of our church, fine Bible-believing young man, went to Bible college. He'd shared his faith with his father many, many times, shared the gospel with him. Mac's wife, Margie, was a believer, so he would come with Margie to our church, sit right in the front row, and listen to the messages, but wasn't a believer. That went on for 2 or 3 years. And one day, Mac called me and he said, I wish you'd come with me. I want to go talk with my brother, because my brother is dying of cancer, and I want to make sure he's right with God. This is from Mac. He doesn't believe. So I said, sure. So he said, I'll take you there. It was about an hour-and-a-half drive. Hopped in the car. We drove there to see his brother. I went in. His brother was in a hospital bed. He was near the end by then. And I started talking with his brother. And his brother had just come to Christ. A local pastor had stopped in to see him, shared the gospel, and led this man to Christ. And it was real. I mean, I quizzed him a little bit. It was real. And he went and started sharing with his brother, who had brought me, about the importance of believing in the gospel of Jesus Christ. Wow. I thought, well, this was a surprise. I didn't expect this when I went. Afterwards, we got back in the car. Margie's in the back seat. I'm in the front seat. Mac's driving, and we're headed up the rural roads there in Maine. And all of us, Margie and I are talking about things. All of a sudden, Max breaks in. I don't know where I'm going to go when I die. I don't know. You got to talk to me. And he starts crying. And tears are streaming down his cheeks. And on that country road in the dark of the night, we're going like this, all over the place. Because he's really, really emotionally touched. And I said, Mac, great, let's get home though. I'm ready to meet the Lord anytime, but I just assume it wasn't right now. And so we got back to his little mobile home, went in, sat down at the kitchen table, and walked him through the gospel to make sure he did really understand it. He prayed and accepted Christ as a Savior. We went through the discipleship process with him. He was baptized, and he and Margie became part of our church. He still continued at our church after I had Margie's funeral. She went to be with the Lord a few years later. And last Sunday, as I was standing there in church, Matt going out in the aisle greeted me. Hi, Pastor. So good to see you. Still a regular member of our body of believers there. I'm no longer the pastor of the church, but yeah, real, genuine. What happened? God happened. It's the Spirit of God. In the Spirit's perfect time, Mac was persuaded. And I asked him, I said, Mac, why did you come all this time? Why did you keep coming to church? And he said, Pastor, I got to tell you, everybody has been trying to get me saved for years. And they're always trying to get me saved. You didn't try to get me saved. You just talked about the Bible. And that's all I really wanted to know, was what the Bible had to say. I wanted to understand the Bible. And so week after week, you explained the Bible to me. And in the end, I wanted to get saved. God's timing is always perfect, isn't it? You all have, I'm sure, similar stories. But that's when real persuasion takes place. That's God-dependent persuasion. That's Spirit-empowered persuasion.